Every single day, Russia feeds hundreds, if not thousands, of its soldiers into the Ukraine war meat grinder. Those soldiers are chewed up, spat out, and in many cases will never make it off the battlefield where Ukraine's drones, artilleries, and mines tear them to shreds. For any other attacking nation in a war, this would be a sign of catastrophic strategic failure. But for Russia, it's all part of the Kremlin plan. Catastrophic Russian losses have been revealed, but the Kremlin is still claiming that the Ukraine war is going according to plan. On October 14th, Euromaidan Press published an article in which it revealed figures provided by the UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD. The numbers don't reflect well on Russia's battle plan in Ukraine. According to the MOD, Russia has suffered a staggering 332,000 casualties so far in 2025. Those numbers run up to October 12th per the MOD's data. So assuming that we can count October as half a month, this number alone means that Russia is losing just under 35,000 of its soldiers monthly in the Ukraine war. And it gets worse. Those 332,000 add to Russia's losses prior to 2025, bringing the grand total of Russian casualties up to 1.118 million since Vladimir Putin launched his full-scale invasion back in February 2022. These MOD numbers roughly align with those provided by Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, though the latter has a slightly higher estimate. It puts the number at around 1.125 million, though a 7,000 soldier difference doesn't seem like much to quibble about. Granted, 7,000 is about the size of Estonia's standing military, which Global Firepower says has 7,700 active personnel, but that's nothing to the Kremlin. 7,000 dead or injured soldiers is all in a week's work for Russia, as you'll discover in a moment. The takeaway here is simple. Russia isn't just losing soldiers, it's losing entire armies. Any other invading nation that saw 1.1 million of its soldiers die for the cause, with 332,000 of those casualties in about 3/4 of a year, would have given up by now. At the very least, it would have declared a ceasefire or come up with some sort of plan B, but not Russia. Far from being a national travesty, this massive casualty rate is all part of the plan. For now, let's come back to the MOD's figures. Sharing its figures on X, the MOD breaks Russia's casualty rate down into daily figures for the last couple of months. It notes that Russia lost an average of 950 soldiers per day in September, which was a moderate increase over the figures seen in August. That, surprisingly, is good news for Russia. September 2025 saw the country's second lowest casualty rate since April 2024, the MOD says, with August 2025 offering the lowest. Euromaidan Press adds that September and August mark sharp declines from the spring of 2025. In March and April, Russia was dealing with a daily casualty rate of around 1,300, the outlet reports, with April alone seeing it lose 36,000 soldiers. September marked a 27% decline from that 2025 high point. But the good news hasn't lasted for Russia. The gradual rise seen in September has continued in October. However, Russia's casualty rate in October 2025 has been steadily increasing, surpassing 1,000 daily casualties every day from the 5th of October through to 12th of October, the MOD reports. So it looks like Russia is getting back to its heavier losing ways as we approach the end of 2025. And when we say heavier, we really mean it. More of Russia's soldiers are dying than ever. Casualties alone don't reveal the true story of Russia's massive manpower losses, because the term casualties covers everybody who is killed, injured, captured, or otherwise taken out of the war. To get the true picture of what's happening to Russia's forces right now, we need to look at the Russian military's ratio of dead to injured. First, some context. Back in World War II, death-to-injury ratios varied depending on the country and the battles it participated in. The DePay Institute says that for the Soviet army, the devastating fight against the invading Nazi army in Kursk saw it hit a ratio of 2.29 injuries to every 1 death during the first week of the battle, followed by a slightly better 2.68 injuries to each death a week later. Other ratios are comparable or better. The UK, for instance, flitted between ratios of 1.67 to 1 and 4.59 to 1 when fighting in Ardennes. The US tended to stick around the 5 injuries for every death mark. Bear in mind that World War II was among the most brutal conflicts seen in the history of mankind. Modern wars tend to have more favorable ratios thanks to advances in medicine and militaries actually caring about evacuating their wounded soldiers. The US campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan provide some solid evidence of that. In Afghanistan, the US had 4.5 wounded per death, while Iraq saw a much higher 7.3 injuries per death. In the latter case, that means that only 1 of every 8 or so soldiers reported as casualties had actually died. We're sharing all of this contextual information with you for a reason. Russia's wounded-to-dead ratio is even worse than the Soviet army had during the fight for Kursk. On October 13th, Politico reported on a joint report between Mediazona and the BBC. That report confirmed Russian losses during the first 8 months of 2025, and it drew a remarkable conclusion. Due to a lack of a normal system of evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, there are only 1.3 wounded soldiers per 1 dead. This signals a low level of survival of the wounded, who are poorly trained in tactical medicine and are usually abandoned without help after injury, the report claims. That throws Russia's casualty figures into an entirely new light. If the country is now losing around 1,000 soldiers per day in October, that means almost half of those casualties are deaths. These are soldiers who are never going to be able to return to fight another day for Putin, meaning they absolutely have to be replaced. Russia isn't just losing soldiers to injury, it's watching its soldiers die on the battlefield, literally. With no real evacuation plans in place, the Kremlin is happily sacrificing the lives of soldiers who could have been saved if Russia were waging anything that even remotely resembles what we know to be a modern war. Russia's wounded-to-dead ratio is worse than the Battle of Kursk in World War II, which still stands as the single largest battle in the history of warfare. But perhaps that battle helps us figure out why this is all part of Russia's plan. As devastating as the Battle of Kursk was for the Soviet Union, it still managed to win the fight. It prevented Germany from launching the major offensive operations it had planned on the Eastern Front, and to many, the battle ended up being the turning point in the war. Right now, we're seeing Russia dealing with a worse wounded-to-dead ratio than even that battle saw, and that may be because Russia believes it can achieve victory in Ukraine through sheer volume of manpower alone. But more on that later in the video. For now, it seems like things are getting even worse on the casualty front for Russia. On October 14th, United 24 media reported that Ukraine reported 190 combat engagements with Russian troops across the entire front line on October 14th alone. Those encounters didn't end well for Russia. Ukraine reported that Russia's military lost 1,200 troops in a single day, along with 5 tanks, 29 artillery systems, 145 vehicles, and 390 unmanned aerial vehicles. Ukraine also conducted many strikes against Russia, the outlet reports, with a particular focus on Russia's command posts and equipment. Over the past day, the Defense Forces' aviation, missile forces, and artillery have struck 7 areas of concentration of personnel and equipment, 3 command posts, and 2 artillery pieces of the Russian invaders, a general staff report states. So not only is Ukraine causing massive casualties for Russia, but it's also targeting the types of infrastructure that Russia needs to organize its future assaults. The logic here is simple. Every command post taken down leads to a less organized Russian assault in the future. And when an assault is disorganized, more Russian casualties are the inevitable result. You may have noticed something else here. The MOD figures we shared earlier said Russia was losing 1,000 soldiers daily during October. On October 14th, Russia lost 200 more than that in a single day, which suggests that the already grim figures for the month are only going to get worse for Russia. This is a far cry from what seemed to be Russia learning a lesson from its massive casualty rate during the late summer and early fall. The casualties were below 1,000 per day in August and September. There seemed to be a hint of a downward trend developing. But no, we're halfway through October and Russia is right back to feeding over 1,000 soldiers per day into the meat grinder, showing us that it has no real alternative strategy for achieving victory in Ukraine. But that's the point. Russia doesn't have a plan B, because it believes that Plan A is working as it's supposed to. That much was made clear on October 10th, when Russia launched a massive airstrike against Ukraine. United 24 media says in the wake of that strike, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that it was satisfied with the outcome of the strikes on Ukraine, adding that all of the targets it wanted to hit had been destroyed. That may have been the case. However, October 10th was also a day when Russia, once again, lost over 1,000 of its soldiers. RBC Ukraine notes that the Ukrainian military's October 11th report covering the previous day revealed that Russia had lost 1,060 soldiers on the day that the Russian Defense Ministry was lauding its own strikes. Russia doesn't even care if the rest of the world is paying attention to its massive casualty rate. It's happy with its airstrikes and pays so little mind to the country's massive casualty count, specifically because what's happening on the ground is going according to plan. Putin has made this kind of claim before. Back in January 2023, after his initial special military operation had failed and Russia found itself embroiled in an attritional war, Putin claimed that what the world was seeing in Ukraine was what Russia wanted it to see. The dynamics are positive. Putin said at the time. Everything is developing within the plan of the Defense Ministry and the General Staff, and I hope that our fighters will please us more than once again with the results of their combat work. By this point in the war, Russia appeared to have hit the 100,000 casualties mark and was veering very close to 150,000 soldiers lost. By March, it would surpass that number, and as we've seen, it's added around 1 million since then. This has been Putin's plan all along. So when the Kremlin says that the Ukraine war is going according to plan, it isn't lying. Russia has made the mass death of its own soldiers a key part of its strategy, in lieu of using the far more modern combined assault approach that would have led to a far lower casualty rate. According to plan may seem strange to any other country that wouldn't be willing to sacrifice several armies' worth of soldiers for a single goal. But for Russia, it's par for the course because attrition, on its own side as well as the enemy's, has always been the Russian way. That's according to the national interest, which says that what is happening in Ukraine aligns closely with how Russia has used its forces during many conflicts of the past. The Russian way of war, so to speak, weaponizes its historically enormous numbers of available troops to achieve success on the battlefield, the outlet said back in April. That's precisely what we've seen in Ukraine. On the ground, at least, Russia has engaged in a strategy that sees it endlessly replenish its forces as Ukraine cuts them down. The same goes for Russia's equipment. What matters to the Kremlin isn't that its soldiers and equipment are being destroyed in Ukraine. That's an expected consequence of the Russian approach to war. The only thing that really matters is that those soldiers and equipment are forcing Ukraine to expend ammunition, to lose people. The slow crawl deeper into Ukraine is being made possible by sheer numbers alone. Going back to World War I, and Russia threw millions of men against the Austro-Hungarian and German forces, the national interest says. During the next World War, Joseph Stalin mobilized the Soviet Union to an unprecedented degree, leading to situations like the Battle of Kursk. Russia is believed to have lost 800,000 soldiers compared to Germany's 200,000 casualties in that battle. But the Battle of Kursk is still seen as one of the great Russian victories. For any other country, that sheer scale of loss would be a catastrophe, a military-ending event that would leave it so weakened that an invading force would be able to do serious damage in future battles. For Russia, those kinds of losses are just part of the plan. And Ukraine proves that Russia takes the same attritional approach when it's on the offense as it does when it's defending. In June, The Telegraph's David Blair published a piece discussing Russia's approach in Ukraine up to that point. His article included an interesting graphic. At the time, it was believed that 250,000 Russian soldiers had died out of a total of 950,000 casualties. Those numbers were recorded after a little over 3 years of warfare. For context, the graphic shows that 58,220 American soldiers died in the 8-year Vietnam War, showcasing how outdated Russia's ground offensive was even over half a century ago. Those numbers conjure an image of Putin casting the entirety of his first invading army into a furnace, then gathering another and doing the same, over and over again, Blair wrote in June. And he isn't wrong. That's exactly what Russia has done, and like the National Interest article, Blair says that Putin's adherence to Russia's history rather than the modern ways of doing war is to blame. He says that the Russian president's frame of reference for what warfare should be doesn't seem to come from any conflict that occurred after 1945. Instead, Putin is steeped in the history of what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union's epic struggle against Hitler's invasion between 1941 and 1945. It seems that World War II is the model for Russia's approach to Ukraine. That, combined with Putin's callous disregard for the numbers of soldiers Russia is losing, explains how the MOD's figures are what Russia claims them to be, all part of the plan. It's just a plan that makes no sense to any modern military because armies are no longer built to fight the way that Russia is fighting. That's not just on the strategic level either. Western militaries don't treat their soldiers with what Blair calls the cold indifference that Putin and his Kremlin cronies show to Russia's troops. Putin is willing to see the suffering. He's fine with Russia experiencing more casualties than practically any other war has seen since the end of World War II. The question has to be asked, why? Part of the answer for why everything is going according to plan, from the Russian perspective, is that Putin's forces are making gains. They're not impressive gains by any stretch of the imagination. However, they do exist. On October 8th, Reuters reported that Putin claims that Russia has managed to capture about 1,930 square miles of Ukraine in 2025 so far. Assuming Putin is telling the truth, which is a big assumption to make, that would amount to about 1% of Ukraine, bringing the total that Russia has captured up to nearly 20% of the country, Reuters claims. In Putin's mind, holding a fifth of the country is evidence that his plan is working. Never mind that the vast majority of those gains were made during the early weeks of the war, which saw Russia capture plenty of territory before Ukraine pushed it back. To the Kremlin, 20% in just over 3.5 years is still 20%. It's proof that the price being paid in Russian soldiers' blood, though heavy, is worth paying. However, there is another reason why Putin is so willing to continue with the Russian plan. Right now, Putin might not be looking to capture all of Ukraine. Instead, he only wants Russia to capture enough of the territory so that Putin has leverage in future peace talks. Putin has constantly stalled peace talks since they began earlier in 2025, and he is doing that for a reason. On August 16th, in the wake of Putin's Alaska meeting with US President Donald Trump, The Guardian revealed that Putin had made Russian control over Luhansk and Donetsk one of his demands. For a ceasefire to even occur in Ukraine, the front lines would have to be frozen, Putin said, indicating that these two regions in particular are what he really wants. And it's for Luhansk and Donetsk that Russia is still grinding through its troops. Everything is going according to plan for Russia because it's making slow progress through these two regions. Every square mile gained, no matter how slowly, amounts to more leverage for Putin. His goal right now seems to be for Russia to occupy Luhansk and Donetsk so completely that Ukraine will be forced to cede them as part of any future peace. Until that occupation is completed, the plan will stay in place. Russia will dedicate many more hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of its soldiers to the cause. Their loss will be worth it in Putin's mind, because every casualty takes him closer to etching himself into the annals of history as the Russian leader who returned Ukraine to its rightful owners. It's a twisted outlook, and it may end up being this very Russian plan that undoes Russia. In April, George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, spoke to the New York Post. He said that the combination of Russia's massive losses and the enormous amounts of money the country is shelling out for its soldiers can't last. The system for generating fighters worked for 2.5 years, but it's starting to fail, Barros claimed. Russia is constrained by the laws of economics, scarce resources, and there isn't an endless manpower resource in Russia. One ISW report adds that the major economic problems being caused by Russia's high casualty rate are likely to mature within another 12 to 18 months. That's right around the end of 2026, and it means that Russia's plan may be running on a deadline. Doc Brown may have not needed roads to get where he was going in Back to the Future, but Russia absolutely needs them to conduct its assaults on Ukraine. Without roads, Russia can't bring the full force of its mechanized units to bear on the city of Pokrovsk, which is only making it harder for them to capture this vital logistical hub. Ukraine understands the importance of the roads near Pokrovsk all too well, and it's making sure those roads have become death traps for Russia's forces. The Russian army in Pokrovsk is being wiped out on Ukraine's roads of death. No one survives the ride because Ukraine has made taking those roads a kamikaze endeavor. That's according to Euromaidan Press, which reported on October 14th that Ukraine has taken the roads of death strategy that worked so well for it several times in the past to a new level near Pokrovsk. Ukraine isn't holding anything back, the outlet reports, as it's sending its best drone units to patrol the roads leading into and around Pokrovsk. Those drones are on constant patrol. They're looking for anything bearing Russian colors, and when they find what they're looking for, those drones take out their targets, all in an effort to cripple Russia's logistical network to ensure all future attacks on Pokrovsk are far weaker than they could otherwise have been. This isn't a direct assault by Ukraine. It's the brilliant weakening of a Pokrovsk force that was 110,000 troops strong at the start of the summer and has been wearing away ever since. It's thanks to these drones establishing what soldiers on the ground are calling roads of death that Russia's latest Pokrovsk offensives have failed so badly. In many cases, those offensives collapse before they've even had the chance to properly begin, which is pushing Putin and his generals into a complete rethink of how Russia can take a city that Ukraine is defending so well. Precision lies at the heart of what Ukraine is doing, Euromaidan Press reports. Complete accuracy is essential when trying to make the roads around Pokrovsk unusable from a Russian logistics standpoint. The outlet says that there are several geolocated videos highlighting the effectiveness of Ukraine's approach, including one where a Russian UAZ van erupts into flames after being struck by one of Ukraine's drones on the roads of death. To showcase just how precise Ukraine is being in its latest defensive strategy, that drone didn't strike the van's engine bay or hit it from the side. Ukraine flew an unmanned vehicle right into the van's open window, only detonating that drone's payload once it was inside. You can only imagine the grisly fate of the Russians driving the van. Another incident saw a Ukrainian drone catch sight of a Russian T-80 tank as it attempted to make its way along another road near Pokrovsk. Hilariously, that tank was trying to sneak along the road as it made its way to provide fire support for an ongoing Russian offensive, Euromaidan Press says. Considering that this is a 93,200-pound tank that measures almost 32.5 feet long and 11.15 feet wide, being stealthy is a pretty tricky proposition. The tank would have been easily spotted by Ukraine's army of patrolling drones, and once it was, Ukraine had another destroyed tank to add to over 11,200 that Ukraine has consigned to the scrap heap since Putin launched his invasion. Russia has at least attempted to give its T-80 some protection against Ukraine's drones, as Euromaidan Press explains. The tank was protected by additional cages and electronic warfare, yet it was still easily hit, the outlet says. The mention of cages is interesting. Cages aren't typical features for tanks, not least because the tank itself is meant to be a rolling ball of armor and firepower that is capable of taking a hit or two. However, Russia has been putting cages on its tanks throughout the Ukraine war in a desperate attempt to counter Ukraine's drones. These devices are called cope cages. They're not always effective. Russia has come up with all sorts of weird and wacky designs for these cope cages. Business Insider shared a few examples in August, highlighting one monster tank that was loaded with so much hardware that it took Ukraine's 60 first-person view or FPV drones to finally take it out. That was a rare example of a Russian cope cage success story that could have only come about because Russia's forces must have had plenty of spare materials lying around. But is it really a success story? Ukraine hit this tank with 60 drones, which means it wasn't even able to attempt any sort of evasive measures. That's thanks to the massive cope cage built around it, which shows us that Russia is so desperate to protect its tanks that it's making them practically non-functional. Other versions of cope cages are more rudimentary than the one Business Insider highlights. Russia has used everything from metal cages and netting to wood and chains, all to try to create makeshift armor to protect its tanks against Ukraine's drones. That armor does sometimes make it harder for Ukrainian drone operators to find weak points, but almost inevitably, the cope cages fail and the Russian armor is destroyed. We don't know what the cope cage tacked onto the T-80 on the Road of Death looked like, but it doesn't matter, Ukraine took it out anyway. Tanks aren't the only victims of Ukraine's roads of death. Ukraine's drone operators aren't picky when it comes to taking out Russian vehicles because everything they find is being used to serve logistical needs of the soldiers assaulting Pokrovsk. Euromaidan Press says that Russia is using supply vehicles of all kinds, vans, pickups, motorcycles, and even lone riders trying to deliver small batches of ammunition or rations to the front are being picked off by Ukraine. The fact that these vehicles are being used at all demonstrates the terrible state of Russia's mechanized forces right now. After losing so many tanks and armored vehicles, Russia is being forced to rely on vehicles that were never designed to take part in wars. Former Forbes correspondent David Axe highlighted the growing scale of Russia's reliance on civilian vehicles back in March. He wrote that Russia ended up facing a difficult problem as it launched more and more assaults against Ukraine's defenses in 2023 and 2024. With more assaults came more losses of equipment, leading to the 11,200 destroyed tanks that we mentioned earlier in the video. Axe also points to a survey from February that claimed civilian vehicles, including cars, ATVs, and even golf carts, accounted for about 70% of all Russia's vehicle losses in that month. It's only gotten worse from there for Russia. Its tank and armored vehicle shortfalls are such that even more civilian vehicles are being used in Ukraine than ever before. Russia's logic seems to be that it can at least use these types of vehicles to transport supplies, meaning it doesn't have to risk any of its armor. However, that logic is easily countered by the fact that civilian vehicles have no defenses against Ukrainian drones that have already proven themselves capable of destroying tanks. By May, Axe, now writing for his Trench Art column, was claiming that 90% of the hundreds of vehicles Russia loses in Ukraine every month are civilian vehicles. This isn't a clever Russian tactic that saves Russia's tanks and armored vehicles. It's a desperate tactic that shows us just how lacking Russia is when it comes to armor as we approach the end of the 4th year of the Ukraine war. As for motorbikes, Russia does at least have a better reason for using those. As CNN reported in April, Russia believes the speed and agility advantages that bikes hold over other types of vehicles make them a good choice for evading Ukraine's drones. Never mind the unprotected rider on the bike who is done for if one of those drones happens to score a hit. Russia is so convinced of the effectiveness of its motorbike-based approach that it's even published propaganda videos showing its soldiers practicing how to launch assaults in groups of 2 or 3 bikes. Just as with other civilian vehicles and the cope cages, the motorbikes are not working. As soon as they try to take any of Ukraine's roads of death, those bikes are being taken out by the very drones they're supposed to be capable of avoiding. The result of Russia's attempted approaches in Pokrovsk is that the roads of death are now littered with the wreckage of vehicles that come in all shapes and sizes. Drone operators relentlessly hunt down any movement, as confirmed by footage from both sides showing the aftermath of the Ukrainian strikes: twisted metal, burning wrecks, and craters every few meters, Euromaidan press reports. And the craziest thing about all of this is that Russia should have learned this lesson several times over by now. Ukraine's creation of impenetrable roads of death using drones is far from a new tactic. It's done the same thing several times before. Take Kursk as an example. Back in August 2024, Ukraine pulled off a successful counter-invasion of that Russian oblast that saw it take several hundred square miles of Russian territory from under Putin's nose. By October of that same year, Russia had finally managed to launch a counter-offensive against the Ukrainians in Kursk. In response to that counter-offensive, Ukraine unleashed its roads of death strategy. Militarny shared what one of these roads looks like in October 2024. It reported on an almost 8.7-mile stretch of Kursk's Snagost-Zeleny Shlak highway, which Ukraine's defenders had turned into a kill zone for any Russian vehicle that attempted to traverse the road. By the time of Militarny's report, over 30 units of Russian equipment had been destroyed on that small stretch of highway in a matter of weeks. Ukraine was using the same strategy that we now see it using in Pokrovsk. Drones were being unleashed onto roads to create an impenetrable barrier. Those drones patrolled constantly, taking out anything they came across. Militarny even shared a video of this Kursk highway, noting that the footage showed 9 destroyed armored personnel carriers, along with 12 infantry fighting vehicles, 5 armored vehicles, and 3 tanks. Still, maybe Russia's soldiers in Pokrovsk hadn't heard about these highways of death. Kursk is hundreds of miles away from Pokrovsk, so maybe what's happening right now is a symptom of failed communication rather than Russia repeating the mistakes that have already cost it dozens of vehicles. You might be able to make that argument were it not for the fact that Ukraine has used the roads of death strategy near Pokrovsk in the past. Euromaidan press even makes that point, noting that these new roads of death mirror those that Ukraine created on the western flank of Pokrovsk just a few short months ago. Footage of the road was shared on YouTube in July. The road is about a 5-mile stretch that connects the settlements of Zvovta, Novopustinka, and Pustinka close to Pokrovsk, and it had become yet another death trap for Russia's vehicles. Over 140 destroyed tanks, armored vehicles, and civilian vehicles were shown on the road. That makes 28.5 vehicles for every mile, which is the sort of traffic jam no Russian soldier wants to find themselves caught up in. And even back then, the vehicles Russia was sending down this road of death were primarily civilian cars and trucks used to support its logistical network. Russia hasn't learned a thing from its past experiences with Ukraine's roads of death, or perhaps more accurately, Russian commanders likely know how dangerous these roads are, and they either don't care or are so desperate to keep supplies flowing that they force their troops to drive on them anyway. Either way, the aftermath is the same. Vehicles are being eliminated by the dozens, and usually long before they get anywhere near the soldiers on the front lines that they're supposed to be supplying. Now that Ukraine has seen the success of its roads of death strategy, it's looking to build on what it's already achieved near Pokrovsk. One of the ways it's doing that, Euromaidan press reports, is by ensuring that Commander Robert Brovdy, who operates under the call sign Magyar, continues to oversee the Pokrovsk sector. Brovdy, who was a businessman and entrepreneur before Putin invaded Ukraine, volunteered to serve in the Territorial Defense Forces of Ukraine on February 7, 2022. It was only a couple of weeks later that Russia's forces rolled into Ukraine, and Brovdy has been fighting against them ever since. Brovdy has been hailed as one of the fathers of Ukraine's drone-centric defense against Russia, even to the point where Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has awarded him with one of Ukraine's highest military honors for his service. He is now the commander of the Unmanned Systems of the Armed Forces of Ukraine branch of the Ukrainian military, and his presence in Pokrovsk goes a long way toward explaining how Ukraine has managed to pull off its roads of death strategy. Brovdy understands drones as well as, or better than practically anybody else in Ukraine's military. His expertise and guidance are helping Ukraine to create the multi-layered drone defenses and patrols that now make the roads of death so dangerous to Russia's soldiers and vehicles. His doctrine is simple: total drone dominance stretching over a dozen kilometers behind the front line, with every meter of road under observation, every vehicle tracked and every movement punished immediately, Euromaidan press says of Brovdy. The Ukrainian defenders in Pokrovsk will be more than happy to have him by their side, and happier still that it seems that Brovdy is going to be staying in Pokrovsk for the foreseeable future. Russia is being forced to do something that it has had to do several times already in Pokrovsk: rethink its strategy. With roads of death being so effective, Russia simply can't use the same tactics that it was using just a few months ago near Pokrovsk. Large mechanized assaults are almost impossible. Russia can't send its tanks and armored vehicles to assault staging areas because those vehicles have to navigate a sea of drones to get anywhere. Motorbikes, which Russia believed could be a remedy for Ukraine's drone-heavy defense, have also proven themselves extremely vulnerable. Faced with these problems, Euromaidan Press reports, Russia has had to pull back the scale of its assaults to the point where it's sending tiny fire teams, often containing 3 soldiers or fewer, to infiltrate Ukraine's defensive positions. RBC Ukraine also reported on this shift in Russian tactics early in September. It said that Russia deployed several of its marine units to Pokrovsk to execute what Russia hoped would be a decisive breakthrough in the region. The problem is that breakthroughs can't happen, or at least can't be sustained, without armor offering fire support. That armor isn't available due to Ukraine's roads of death, so Russia is relying on the small groups we've already mentioned. A report by the 7th Army Corps of the Air Assault Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine explains what Russia is trying to do now that its mechanized assaults have been rendered useless. The enemy's main goal in Pokrovsk, to get as close as possible to the positions of drone operators or mortar crews, to try to disperse our defense forces, gain a foothold in new positions, and also expand the boundaries of the grey zone, the 7th Army Corps said in a Facebook post. Some would say that this is a smart tactical change-up by Russia. Rather than sending its vehicles into the firing line, it's sending infiltrators to get in behind Ukraine's lines so they can target the people operating the drones that stop those vehicles in their tracks. However, Brovdi sees exactly what Russia is trying to do, and he's already arranging counters to deal with this new strategy. With the roads of death established, Euromaidan Press says, Brovdi is now ordering Ukraine's drones to prioritize Russia's infantry ahead of its vehicles. Pokrovsk's drone operators now have minimum monthly kill rates. Those rates need to be higher than Russia's ability to mobilize new soldiers in the Pokrovsk direction, Euromaidan Press reports. We may see the start of a circuitous strategy emerging here. Right now, Brovdi and his forces are targeting Russia's infantry because they represent the greatest threat to Pokrovsk. Vehicles are less of a threat because Russia has finally figured out that the roads of death aren't worth risking. Eventually, Russia may work out that Ukraine is targeting its soldiers rather than its vehicles, which could in turn lead to it trying the roads of death again. Brovdi will be watching for this. As soon as Russia starts trying to build up for a mechanized assault or get its logistical networks up and running again, the odds are that Pokrovsk's drone operators will start hitting the vehicles again. It's a game of reactions and counter-reactions. Based on just how many soldiers and vehicles Russia is losing in Pokrovsk, this seems to be a game that Ukraine is winning. Ukraine's roads of death are stopping Putin from claiming Pokrovsk in the fall, which is putting Russia far behind its leader's schedule. Pokrovsk was supposed to be Russia's by the end of the summer. Now Putin is growing ever more desperate. According to Zelensky, Russia is now trying for a stronger push against Pokrovsk to cover up for the losses its military has experienced in Dobropilya. On October 9th, Pravda reported Zelensky as stating, "They initially said by September, then postponed the deadline to November." That comment was made in reference to Putin's stated deadline for taking the Donbas region of Ukraine. The operation has definitely influenced the defense of Pokrovsk. Realizing their heavy losses near Dobropilya, the Russians have now been ordered to take Pokrovsk urgently, at any cost. We know what "at any cost" means to Putin. Russia will be sending more soldiers and perhaps more vehicles into Pokrovsk. How effective these new offensives will be is anybody's guess. The roads of death are still very much active, and they're ready to crush any new Russian offensive, just as they crushed everything that Russia has tried since the failed summer campaign to take Pokrovsk. Still, Putin won't care how many soldiers he loses as long as Pokrovsk eventually falls. After all, he's more than happy to let Russia's soldiers die in Sumy, so why not Pokrovsk as well?
Russia has more than its share of problems on the Ukrainian battlefield. Over 1 million of the country's soldiers have been killed or injured, along with tens of thousands of units of military equipment being destroyed. However, it may end up not being what Ukraine achieves inside Ukraine that ends Vladimir Putin's war. It could be a problem inside Russia. A seemingly incurable disease that's afflicted Russia since the Soviet era is now on the verge of wrecking the country. Russia has a Dutch disease, and it's rotting the country from within. That's according to Paul Warburg, who posted a YouTube video on October 10, detailing how Russia's version of the Dutch disease is multi-layered and may be one of the worst cases ever seen. But before digging into Warburg's points, perhaps a little context is needed. It's important to understand what the Dutch disease is before being able to see how Russia is afflicted with what may be a country-ending dose of that disease. As the name implies, the Dutch disease is named after a very specific incident that occurred in the Netherlands from the late 1950s. It It all started when the Dutch discovered natural gas deposits in the North Sea in 1959. Naturally, the Dutch started extracting and selling this gas, leading to a ton of new wealth that also led to the value of Netherlands' currency rising sharply. That all sounds great until the downside becomes clear. A single product having this much of an effect on a country isn't great for the other products that the country sells. As the Netherlands enjoyed the newfound wealth being generated by its energy industry, other business sectors inside the country started to collapse. The Dutch guilder, getting so much stronger, had the unintended side effect of weakening Dutch exports of non-energy products. Unemployment skyrocketed from 1.1% to 5.1% as businesses outside the energy sector were forced to close their doors for several reasons. Those companies couldn't make as much money as they needed to make, and they were also dealing with a surging industry that could offer better wages to their potential employees. Everybody wanted to work in Dutch oil and gas, and other Dutch industries started collapsing as a result. This situation illustrates what happens when a nation places all of its eggs into a single sector's basket. Nobody can blame the Netherlands for trying to make as much money as it could from its newfound gas and oil deposits. Any other nation would do the same thing. However, the sheer pace of the surge of the country's energy industry shattered everything around it. That's the Dutch disease in a nutshell. And right now, Russia has a terrible case of this disease that could cause its economy to collapse long before Ukraine can physically expel Russia's invaders from its territory. And that leads back to Warburg's video, which he opens by highlighting the size of the catastrophe that looms large in Russia's future.
But when you look at the Russian economy right now, they are actually afflicted with this very specific economic disease, not just at one level, but on multiple different levels that gets worse the deeper you look.
And, just as with the Dutch, it all starts with Russia's energy industry. Highlighted by Warburg as the most significant symptom of Russia's Dutch disease, Russia's energy industry is on its knees right now. That's especially the case for its gasoline and refined oil sectors, which have been under constant Ukrainian bombardment for the last couple of months. On October 14 alone, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia has asked its Federal Anti-Monopoly Service to impose maximum prices at gas stations across the country. That's happening because there are major shortages that are creating supply and demand issues. With gas stations receiving so little of the gasoline that they sell, some are raising their prices to take advantage of the demand for a product that is now in very limited supply. Russia is trying to force the prices back down through legislation, but that doesn't change the fact that many of its gas stations simply don't have enough of the product that they need to sell. Many of Russia's gas stations have stopped selling altogether. In the country's southern federal district alone, 220 gas stations, which amount to 14% of the district's total, have suspended fuel sales entirely. Russia, of course, claims that this is a temporary problem. On October 13, Russia's finance minister, Anton Siluanov, tried to claim that Russia has this problem under control. Regarding the specific issue of fuel prices in certain regions, it's clear that there are currently some supply constraints, which, I'm confident, will be overcome in the near future. Reuters reports Siluanov as claiming. He's wrong. The supply constraints he mentions are being caused by Ukraine's long-range drone strikes, and those strikes aren't just going to stop because Russia hopes that they will.
And this is a direct result of Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, in particular Russian oil refineries, which are not letting up, they are only increasing with each passing day.
As Warburg points out, that's not what Russia wants to hear. As the BBC reported on October 2nd, Ukraine has hit 21 of Russia's 38 large refineries already in 2025, with several of them being hit multiple times. That's a 48% increase over 2024's refinery strike figures, and there's no reason for Ukraine to stop now. It can see the impact its attacks are having not just in the queues that are now forming at Russia's gas stations, but in the desperate measures Russia is taking to overcome its fuel crisis. For instance, Russia is turning to other countries to get its hands on gasoline. On October 1st, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia is now turning to Asia to maintain its domestic supplies of gasoline after Ukraine's refinery strike shut down almost 40% of the country's refining capacity. China appears to be among those countries, and that issue will be explored shortly, as is Belarus. It's here where the first symptom of Russia's Dutch disease really starts to rear its head. Russia shouldn't have to buy gasoline. oil and gas are the country's two most powerful economic drivers. Now that it doesn't have gasoline to sell, Russia is dealing with a massive hit. As Wahlberg notes,
Russia's energy exports make up the majority of income within the entire country. Even those incomes that don't come directly from energy exports often come indirectly from energy exports.
In other words, businesses that support Russia's energy industry, like the gasoline stations already mentioned, will struggle whenever Russia's overall energy sector is hurting. That's the Dutch disease Russia suffers from, at least on the surface level. It goes much deeper, but before explaining how, it's worth exploring a painful little irony that Russia is dealing with right now. China is one of the countries from which Russia is going to be buying refined oil products to make up for the shortfall it's currently experiencing. China, of course, has been one of Russia's main customers for crude oil since the Ukraine war began. China bought more than 100 million tons of Russian crude in 2024 alone, taking advantage of cut price rates along the way. Wahlberg notes that Russia's oil sales to China were likely barely profitable due to China having Russia over a barrel as one of its few remaining major customers. The irony is that the crude oil China has bought so much of is now being sold back to Russia in the form of refined products that carry higher prices than crude. Russia thought that China was helping to support it financially in a war with Ukraine. The reality is that China is more than happy to exploit Russia's weakened position, which makes the Dutch disease afflicting Russia all the more debilitating. Geopolitically, China has played Russia like a fiddle, as the Jamestown Foundation highlighted as far back as December 2023. Russia is being increasingly forced to supply strategic resources to partners on highly unfavorable terms in exchange for minor displays of political support and assistance, the foundation said almost 2 years ago. Not a lot has changed, outside of China taking its exploitation of Russia's vulnerability further by using its refined oil products to earn back some of the money Putin had hoped that he could dedicate to the Ukraine war. Now, Russia's struggling gasoline industry was mentioned as the major symptom of its Dutch disease. Others run much deeper, as becomes clear from Wahlberg's offhand comment about how even industries that support Russia's energy sector are dependent on the success of that sector. The same goes for almost every other industry in Russia, for the simple reason that Russia is a massive country. It's here where the genius of Ukraine's refinery striking strategy really comes into play. Wahlberg notes that Russia's refineries are spread all over the country, so Ukraine has responded by hitting as many as it can, as deep as its weapons will allow it to strike. There's a very good reason that Russia's refineries are spread out as they are, as Wahlberg reveals.
The reason that refineries are geographically distributed all across the country is to lower last-mile transport costs, so that refined energy doesn't have to travel as far.
Think about what that means for Russia right now. The refineries that it still has operating at a decent capacity are those that are out of reach of Ukraine's long-range drones. That also means those refineries are a long way away from the Russian regions that need more gasoline. Russia is now being forced to transport refined oil products further, using those very products to fuel the trucks and trains engaging in these longer journeys. The same goes for the refined oil that Russia is importing, by the way. Russia only has so many ports into which those products can arrive. The gasoline Russia is buying all needs to be transported over large distances to get to where it needs to go. That's a second layer of cost, and it sees Russia's Dutch disease doubling down on itself. The only cure Russia has come up with for its oil dependence is a solution that only makes that dependence larger. Russia's economy could functionally seize up as a result of this problem, Wahlberg says.
Both because of the lost revenues and the increased costs, but also for the simple fact that if people can't use energy, they can't buy, sell, or trade with each other.
Pravda says that over half of Russia's regions have been hit by gasoline shortages as of October 12. In several of those regions, Russian consumers are being limited to buying as little as 10 to 20 liters of gasoline per visit to a gas station, assuming they can buy any gasoline at all. That amounts to 4.39 gallons at best, which is nowhere near enough to fill the tanks of most cars. For Russian business owners who rely on travel around the country to keep their companies running, whether their own travel or that of their employees, conditions are dire. Cars can barely fill up enough to reach the limits of their own regions, never mind traveling into other areas of Russia. As mentioned earlier, the Dutch disease affects businesses outside of the one in which a country enriches itself. In the Netherlands case, a skyrocketing currency negatively impacted other sectors. For Russia, the loss of its most important products is causing issues because Russia can't keep up with its domestic companies' gasoline demands. And Russia can't do much to solve this Dutch disease problem either. After all, it's a problem that's existed for decades, and it's one that cannot be solved within the system of government under which Russia operates. Warburg makes this point, noting that the original carriers of the Dutch disease managed to recover because the Netherlands is a democratic nation. Russia, on the other hand, is an oligarchy.
In a democratic country, the Netherlands had incentives to fix the problem, while in an oligarchy, a dictatorship, the people at the top had incentives to not care about the rest of the economy, but rather to lean into what made them personally more profitable.
Russia's economic woes throughout the Ukraine war are well known, but its oligarchs aren't struggling. In August, Newsweek reported that Russia's richest billionaires are all getting wealthier very quickly. Over the last year alone, those oligarchs have added $20 billion to their collective wealth. It's a sort of short-sighted greed that is sure to be fed further now that Russia has so many problems with its main product. Again, supply and demand come into play. Russia's surviving oil refiners can now command more money for their products domestically because of the shortages Russia is experiencing. That's already evident. As France 24 reports, AI-92 and AI-95 gasoline are now trading at $900 and $1,000 per ton, respectively, which puts both close to their all-time highs. Russia's oligarchs are cashing in, and Putin is almost certainly among them, as the rest of Russia struggles. There is no incentive in Russia to fix this problem. The oligarchs won't allow it. Other industries are struggling as a result, as the Moscow Times highlighted in August. The previous July saw Russia's manufacturing sector shrink at its fastest rate since March 2022, the outlet says. The sector's Purchasing Managers Index dropped to 47 in July, down from 47.5 in June. Any number below 50 is a signal of a sector in decline, and this is exactly the sort of problem that the Dutch disease causes. Other sectors weaken as Russia plows its collective energy and money into the one sector that generates the most wealth. And if there's any doubt that energy is that wealth maker for Russia, consider the figures offered by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. It says that revenue from Russia's oil and gas industry accounts for between 30 and 50% of Russia's total federal budget in any given year, in addition to accounting for about 20% of Russia's gross domestic product. Putin doesn't want to change that. Russia actively strangles any innovators across all fields because control is more important than growth to Putin. Back in June, the Moscow Times reported that Putin claims that we need to strangle them, in reference to Western tech giants that might intend to invest in Russia. Those tech giants would provide opportunities for Russians outside of the oligarchy bubble to make successes of themselves, which would erode the control the oligarchy has over the rest of the population. So, the status quo has to stay in place. The Dutch disease must continue to fester. Of course, this creates an obvious issue, as Warburg explains. He notes that Russia doesn't have innovative brands that sell products to the rest of the world. The same goes for many other Russian industries.
And it basically means that when you remove the energy sector, as has now happened, the Russian economy as a whole can quickly crumble like a house of cards.
And that leads nicely into the next point. Russia's Dutch disease runs even deeper than already discussed. As noted earlier, much of Russia's federal budget is reliant on the country's energy sector. Guess where a lot of the money from that budget is going right now? The Russian arms industry, of course. That sector represents one of the very few growth industries that Russia has right now, and it's been receiving a ton of funding that can only come thanks to oil and gas revenue. So much funding, in fact, that Warburg says that this one industry has caused massive wage hikes across Russia, which is in turn leading to labor shortages across other sectors. Think back to the example of what happened with the Netherlands earlier in the video. It showed that a single surging industry can lead to potential employees abandoning other sectors to make as much as they can from that other industry. Right now, weapons production is that surging industry in Russia, albeit one that's only made possible by Russia's energy sector, and other Russian industries are starting to feel the pinch. That means Russia's Dutch disease doesn't just affect the country on a national level, it's hurting Russia on the local level too. BBC Monitoring highlighted this problem in February when it reported on Russia having enjoyed a 4.6% year-on-year increase in industrial output in 2024. That growth was fueled by sectors including metal fabrication, electronics, and machinery and equipment repair, all of which are intrinsically linked to the war economy Putin has created in Russia. But the impact was being felt elsewhere. BBC Monitoring said that 13% of Russia's businesses claimed to have a shortage of working capital during the first quarter of 2024. That had risen to 25% by the end of the year. Manufacturing was only growing because of the war industry too. The outlet quotes Spidell Finance, which says, according to preliminary estimates, of the 18.3 percentage points of manufacturing growth over 3 years, more than 20 percentage points are accounted for by the military-industrial complex factor through intersectoral linkages. It's impossible to make precise estimates, which means the civilian sector is predominantly in the negative. That was in 2024. The situation is only getting worse in 2025. Why would the average Russian want to work anywhere other than a war-related industry when the war is paying so well? In the short term, these kinds of local-level issues don't immediately rear their heads. People getting paid more due to switching to roles in Russia's military-industrial complex can then spend more at the local businesses, such as restaurants and shops, than they would have in the past. That assumes any of those local businesses survive when they can't compete with the wages being offered elsewhere. But this is all short-term, as Warburg points out.
It will obviously end when the war ends and these companies go out of business, and these local economies will be completely robbed of all of this income, but all of the traditional employers will already be out of business, and that will be absolutely devastating.
It's the small military towns that will struggle the most, with a tale that's almost as old as the industry itself. When entire communities are built around just one industry, those communities collapse when that industry goes under. Just look at the US Rust Belt for proof. Assuming you exclude New York City, America's Rust Belt was home to a third of the country's population in 1950, according to Forbes. Steel, coal, and vehicles were the main products produced across this belt. But as time went on, the manufacturing of steel and vehicles was outsourced to other countries. Coal, on the other hand, became a less desirable product as oil, gas, and eventually clean energy solutions took over. By 2000, the population of the Rust Belt accounted for a quarter of America's total population, rather than a third. People were jumping ship to other states and other industries because the work in traditional Rust Belt sectors had dried up. Entire communities were destroyed as a result. And the same thing is going to happen when Russia's wartime economy ends. Only Russia, as an oligarchy, won't be providing as many options to people afterward. Again, it's the oligarchy versus democracy argument. Innovations elsewhere in the US at least allowed people who had previously lived and worked in the Rust Belt to chase opportunity elsewhere. In Russia, the only opportunities that exist are those provided by the oligarchy. So what Russia is experiencing is a triple dose of the Dutch disease. Its energy sector, upon which the entire house of cards stands, is crumbling. If and when that sector collapses, Russians who are already struggling to travel and trade within their own country will be stranded, destroying many businesses. And with the combined collapse of the energy sector and the end of the Ukraine war, Russia's wartime economy disappears and entire local communities will be ruined. Russia just unleashed yet another massive strike against Ukraine. It deployed hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles over the border, targeting numerous towns and cities far and wide across Ukrainian regions, including the capital of Kyiv and other major cities such as Kharkiv and Dnipro. It's the same sort of thing Ukraine has been forced to deal with on a near nightly basis for many months now, and attacks like this often cause mass casualties and widespread destruction, with residential homes and other buildings reduced to rubble. But Ukraine was ready for this attack, and its response has been both swift and brutal, a powerful demonstration of just how far the country has come. The Russian strike occurred overnight on October 9 into the early hours of October 10. As they have done so many times before, the Kremlin's forces launched a gigantic aerial assault against Ukraine, deploying close to 500 aerial weapons in a single strike. To be more precise, the attack involved a mixture of ballistic and cruise missiles, plus Shahid-style drones and other attack drones. In total, the Ukrainian Air Force calculated 497 aerial threats, including a whopping 465 drones of various varieties and 32 missiles. To make matters worse, Russia attacked from numerous directions. Missiles and drones were sent over the borders from the north, east, and even from the south, entering Ukraine from Russia's Kursk, Milerova, Shatalova, Orel, Shakhty, and Primorsko-Akhtarsk regions. 200 Iranian-made Shahed drones led the way, with additional swarms following behind. Russian forces also launched 2 Kinzhal ballistic missiles from the Lipetsk direction, 14 Iskander-M ballistic missiles capable of reaching peak speeds of more than 5,000 miles per hour or 7 times the speed of sound, and 12 Iskander-K cruise missiles, plus 4 additional Kh-59-69 guided air launch missiles too. This wasn't just a massive attack, it was one that involved a diverse array of weaponry. And that made it distinctly more difficult to deal with, because none of those weapons follow the same patterns and behaviors. They're all different, all unique, and all demand completely different approaches to counter them and bring them down before they strike their targets. If Ukraine only had to deal with 500 Shahed drones, for example, and no other drone or missile varieties, it would know exactly how fast those Shaheds can travel, how far they can go, and what they're capable of. Its forces would therefore be able to quickly discern the best ways to bring them down and deploy the relevant defenses, likely taking out almost all of the drones while suffering minimal damages. Or if Ukraine only had to deal with a single type of missile, it would at least be able to identify the model in question and take the appropriate measures to counteract it. However, when Russia mixes things up to such an extent, sending so many different types of drones and missiles, all moving at different speeds and altitudes and in different patterns, Ukraine's defenders have a much more challenging task on their hands. They can't rely on a single system or strategy of air defense to deal with all of those diverse weapons. They have to respond rapidly, proactively, and in equally diverse ways, choosing the right solutions at the right times to repel each and every incoming threat. And that's exactly why Russia attacked in this way. They used different drones, missiles, and various launch vectors too, all in an attempt to both confuse and overwhelm Ukraine's defenses, and they likely had high hopes for this particular strike. The Kremlin may have envisioned widespread destruction across Ukraine, with dozens of buildings destroyed and dramatic numbers of deaths and injuries. It may too have hoped to gain precious intelligence about potential weak points within the Ukrainian air defense network, which it could use to inform its follow-up strikes in the days and weeks ahead. On paper, the Kremlin had good reason to be confident. As previously mentioned, attacks of this kind are notoriously difficult to deal with, and almost any other country in the world would absolutely struggle to defend itself against a strike of such magnitude. That includes major military superpowers. Even countries boasting some of the world's biggest defense budgets and strongest armies are still only taking their first steps into the rapidly evolving world of drone warfare, and they've yet not mastered the tactics and strategies required to withstand such intense and unpredictable aerial assaults. This was demonstrated when Russian drones recently entered Polish airspace. Poland's air force, supported by NATO allies, scrambled fighter jets to bring them down, but only managed to take out 4 drones in total, despite an estimated 19 to 23 of them entering the area. If Poland or another NATO nation had to face off against hundreds of drones, as well as missiles, those tactics simply wouldn't suffice. But Ukraine is different, because Ukraine has been dealing with this kind of thing for a long time now. It suffered innumerable drone and missile attacks just like this one. Only a month ago, it had to cope with the biggest Russian strike of the war so far, involving over 800 Shahed-type drones and 13 cruise and ballistic missiles launched towards Kyiv and other cities on the night of September 7. Earlier this month, another massive attack took place, with over 500 attack drones and more than 50 missiles targeting numerous regions around Ukraine, including Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Zaporizhia, Cherniv, Kharkiv, Kherson, Sumy, Kirovohrad, and Odessa. This is the tragic reality of the war today. With every passing week, fresh reports emerge of record-breaking Russian attacks. Thousands of drones and hundreds of missiles have entered Ukrainian airspace every single month in 2025, and this level of intense aggression is not likely to stop or subside anytime soon. So, on October 9, when the Kremlin's commanders once more ordered a major attack on multiple Ukrainian towns and cities, they're most likely expected to sit back, relax, and listen as reports flooded in of direct hits, infrastructure destruction, and dozens or even hundreds more innocent Ukrainian civilians killed or wounded. Unfortunately for Russia and its president Vladimir Putin, the attack definitely did not turn out the way they had hoped, because not only does Ukraine have more experience than any other country in the world when it comes to suffering massive drone attacks on a remarkably regular basis, it's also better than almost any other country on the planet when it comes to countering those attacks too. And that's exactly what happened here. Despite the frightening scope and scale of the assault, Ukraine's integrated air defense network, which includes everything from mobile fire units to electronic warfare teams, fighter aviation crews, and surface-to-air missile brigades, responded rapidly and effectively. So, by 10 a.m. on October 10, the Ukrainian forces had successfully taken out almost every single aerial threat. In total, they brought down or suppressed 420 targets, including 405 of the enemy drones and multiple missiles, including a Kinzhal, 4 Iskander-Ms, 9 Iskander-Ks, and a Kh-59-69. This was confirmed in a Facebook post published on the official account for the Air Force Command of Ukrainian Armed Forces. On the night of October 10, from 1900 hours on October 9, the enemy launched a combined strike on the territory of Ukraine using strike UAVs, air and ground-based missiles. In total, the Air Force radio technical troops detected and escorted 497 air attack vehicles, 32 missiles and 465 UAVs of various types. The air attack was repelled by aviation, anti-aircraft missile troops, electronic warfare and unmanned systems units, and mobile fire groups of the Defense Forces of Ukraine. According to preliminary data, as of 10 a.m., air defenses shot down suppressed 420 air targets. 405 enemy UAVs of the Shahid Gerbera types, drones of other types, 1 aeroballistic missile Kh-47M2 Dagger, 4 Iskander MKN-23 ballistic missiles, 9 Iskander-K cruise missiles, and 1 Kh-59-69 guided aircraft missile. In addition, 4 enemy missiles did not reach their targets, lost in location. The places of impact are being specified. Direct hits of 13 missiles and 60 strike UAVs were recorded at 19 locations, and downed ones, fragments fell at 7 locations. So, not only did Ukraine manage to take out close to 85% of Russia's aerial weaponry, but several additional missiles failed to strike their targets, with just a small fraction, 13 missiles and 60 unmanned aerial vehicles, actually dealing damage. This just shows how incredibly effective Ukraine has become in regard to resisting and withstanding Russia's aerial attacks, and how impressive its vast and multi-layered air defense umbrella is today, thanks to both domestic developments and innovations, as well as invaluable support from Ukraine's many allies across the NATO alliance and Western world. Indeed, the very fact that Ukraine was able to bring down a Kinzhal, which is one of the fastest ballistic missiles in existence today, capable of reaching speeds of Mach 10 or more than 7,600 miles per hour, is perhaps the most impressive element of this entire story. It shows that Ukraine's defenders are making smart use of the sophisticated Western-supplied air defense systems like American Patriots and SAM-T batteries to counterattack hypersonic missiles that have in the past been described as unstoppable in the air. Every time Ukraine pulls off a feat like this, it undermines Russia's confidence and erodes any sliver of strategic advantage the Kremlin thinks it might have. It also validates Ukraine's strategy and proves that the country is on the right path, growing stronger and more resilient by the day. Of course, despite the numerous encouraging aspects of this incident, some of the drones and missiles still managed to bypass Ukraine's defenses and deal damage across the country. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky took to X to detail the full and frank impact of the attack, writing, "At many critical infrastructure sites, recovery efforts continue following Russia's strike on the energy sector. It was a cynical and calculated attack with more than 450 drones and over 30 missiles targeting everything that sustains normal life. Everything the Russians want to deprive us of. As of now, more than 20 people across the country have been reported injured. All are receiving the necessary assistance. Sadly, a child was killed in Zaporizhia as a result of the attack. My sincere condolences to the family and loved ones." The tragic loss of a young and innocent life reminds us that even when Ukraine is able to ably defend its territory against the vast majority of Russia's drones and missiles, those that manage to evade the interceptors, EW systems, and mobile fire units are still able to deal unspeakable damage. Zelensky continues, "In Kyiv, repair crews are working to restore power and water supply. Power outages have been reported in the Kyiv, Donetsk, Chernihiv, Cherkasy, Kharkiv, Sumy, Poltava, Odessa and Dnipro regions. Zaporizhia, Kirovohrad and Kherson regions are also recovering after the attack. All relevant services are working on recovery and first responders are operating wherever needed. I receive regular reports from Minister for Development of Communities and Territories Oleksiy Kuleba, Minister of Energy Svitlana Grinchuk, Minister of Internal Affairs Igor Klimenenko and local officials. Maximum efficiency is required from government representatives at all levels. Ending his tweet, Zelensky condemned the Kremlin's actions, noting that this was yet another case of Russia targeting civilian and energy infrastructure rather than viable military targets, while urging Ukraine's allies throughout Europe and across the Atlantic in North America to continue to enforce sanctions and send support to Ukraine. It's precisely the civilian and energy infrastructure that's the main target of Russia's strikes ahead of the heating season. Together, we can protect people from this terror. What's needed is not window dressing but decisive action from the United States, Europe and the G7 in delivering air defense systems and enforcing sanctions. We count on a response to this brutality from the G20 and from all those who speak of peace in their statements yet refrain from taking real steps. The world can defend itself against these crimes, and doing so will undoubtedly strengthen global security. Thank you to everyone who's helping. There's no doubt that Ukraine will indeed benefit from additional support from its allies in order to withstand whatever Russia sends its way in the weeks and months to come. However, in the meantime, this incident shows that Kyiv is doing quite a remarkable job of defending its land and fending off a large part of the Kremlin's threats. It takes a staggering level of air defenses, technology, strategy and coordination to be able to take out hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles in the span of a single night. But this is exactly what Ukraine did on October 9, and it's exactly what it's done on numerous other occasions in the weeks and months prior to that. Back on October 5, for instance, when Russia launched a similarly massive attack involving close to 550 aerial attack objects in total, fired from multiple directions, Ukrainian air defense systems successfully repelled 478 targets, including 439 Shahed and Gerberer drones, a Kinzhal missile, 32 Iskander-K cruise missiles, and 6 Kalibr cruise missiles too. The same sort of story repeats itself on a regular basis. Russia fires hundreds of drones Ukraine's way, and Ukraine somehow manages to bring almost all of them down, sending millions, if not billions of dollars worth of Russian military equipment up in smoke. Tragically, some losses do still occur, and Ukraine's people have been forced to grieve thousands of civilian casualties this year alone. The situation is neither stable nor sustainable, but the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces are able to consistently stop upwards of 80% of all incoming aerial threats is a cause for celebration. It's not enough to save every single life and keep every building intact, but it makes a massive difference in terms of limiting the levels of damage that the Kremlin's drones and missiles can do. It's worth noting too that Ukraine appears, on the whole, to be getting better and better bringing down Russian drones in vast quantities and minimizing the number of casualties and the amount of damage incurred with each successive attack on its territory. In the meantime, while Russia continues with these reckless and ruthless aerial assaults on civilian infrastructure like hospitals, homes and power stations, Ukraine responds with far more brutally efficient attacks of its own. Indeed, only a few days after this incident, on the 9th of October 13, Ukrainian drones struck the biggest Russian oil depot in the Crimean coastal city of Feodosia. A massive fire broke out in the wake of the attack, and a source from the Ukrainian Security Service, SBU, revealed the full extent of the damage, telling the Kyiv Independent, "Drones hit at least 5 tanks. A large-scale fire is recorded on the territory of the oil depot." Videos captured by locals and shared online soon painted a clear picture of the scene, showing a massive blaze and thick clouds of black smoke rising up from the depot and filling the skies over the city of Feodosia. Residents also reported that the glow of the fire was visible from far and wide, while the SBU source stated that a nearby electrical substation had also been damaged in the attack, along with a separate substation in the inland city of Simferopol, adding, "The SBU continues to systematically reduce the enemy's military, logistical and economic capacity to wage war against Ukraine." The Russian Defense Ministry, meanwhile, stated that it shot down over 100 Ukrainian drones across both Russian regions and occupied Ukrainian territories, including 40 above Crimea. Clearly, the Kremlin's best efforts, once more, were not enough to stop the strike on this critical piece of oil infrastructure, and there's no telling just how much oil has quite literally gone up in flames as a result of the attack. It's known that the facility, which is a multifunctional location used for transshipment of oil and oil products between rail tanks, sea vessels, and road transport networks, can hold a staggering 250,000 tons of fuel in total. This makes it a vital cog in the Kremlin's war machine, supplying the fuel needed to power everything from jeeps to tanks, aircraft, generators, and more. Reports also indicate that even a day after the attack, the facility was still ablaze, with a massive column of stock still visible many miles away, according to local media reports and Telegram posts from the Crimean Wind Channel, which wrote, "Poisonous smoke floats over the city, which can be seen from the starry Krim 25 kilometers away. The smell can be felt even 10 kilometers from the place of the fire." Crimean Wind also noted that more than 800 people had been evacuated from the area, revealing in additional posts that 6 fuel tanks were ablaze and a colossal column of smoke, measuring approximately 36 kilometers, 22 miles in length, was stretching across Crimea towards the Kerch Peninsula, demonstrating just how enormous the initial blaze must have been. This is yet another perfect example of the clear difference in tactics between the two sides. Russia throws everything it has at disparate targets all over Ukraine, relying on brute force to overwhelm its opposition and deal as much damage as it can to any people or buildings in its way, including innocent civilians and inoffensive pieces of infrastructure. Ukraine, meanwhile, chooses its targets far more carefully, picking off key pieces of Russia's fuel infrastructure one after another to plunge the country into a state of chaos. Its attacks have proven dramatically more effective than those of its enemy, as Russia currently faces an unprecedented fuel crisis, with prices rising by 50% or even more in some regions, and numerous gas stations forced to either shut down entirely or limit the amount and types of fuel that customers are allowed to purchase. The latest strikes on Feodosia oil depot will only deepen this crisis, plunging the Kremlin into an even more desperate and hopeless situation. Now, learn much more about this particular incident and how it ties into Ukraine's broader strategy of targeting energy infrastructure in our recent video on the topic. Alternatively, check out this video to see how Russia's seemingly invincible and so-called state-of-the-art T-90M tanks lasted less than a day on the battlefields of Ukraine. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, to remain informed and up to date on all the biggest news and developments from this war and other important military conflicts taking place around the world.